Hello, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much, Sharon, for that introduction. And thank you for AI Tech North for letting us join you today. So I just want to explain why we were invited to talk to AI for leaders. And the leaders we have in mind here really come in two types. One are the leaders of small companies and scale-up companies, exactly as Sharon has explained, to try and demystify the world of intellectual property and explain how we can make sure you are really solidly protected for all of the work you're doing in AI. But the other kind of leader are thought leaders. So we're here discussing intellectual property. Now, we've talked a lot this afternoon, my fellow speakers, about AI and what it can do and the dangers of AI. And even Jamie said, you know, at some point AI might be outstripping human minds. But we're talking here about what the human mind does do. And one of the things that the human mind does do is develop all of this AI and make software and hardware which is innovative and which will drive this technology forward. Heather showed us a very interesting slide. You know, I'm a scientist by background, and it intrigued me, which had a load of computers and wires all connected together. And in that slide, there would no doubt have been an enormous amount of innovation in the chips, in the connectivity, in the underlying software running on those chips. And hopefully, the company who developed any pieces of that would have had some proper intellectual property protection. So what we're talking about here are intangible assets. These are not things that you can see. And a lot of people think that AI is a bit, well, fuzzy in a way, and how do you define it? But actually, it can be defined. It is a real thing. It is software running on computers. In a financial sense, when you're looking at company valuations, however, the intellectual property is not something that you can readily see. It's an intangible asset. It's an invisible asset, but it is very real. And one of the things that we're going to explain to you today is how you crystallize the value of that asset. So on this slide here is just a reminder that nowadays, most companies, and these are some of our biggest companies in the world, a huge majority of their value is actually made up with these intangible assets. So I'm just going to hand over to Tom at this point. Tom's going to talk you through what investors want to see in your companies when you are considering the innovation that you're making in AI. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Virginia. So particularly for startups and scale-ups, what do we mean by the value of your IP assets? It's primarily likely to be the value that is perceived to have in the context of your business by investors and potential investors. So it's a simple question, really, when it comes to it. When it comes to your intellectual property, what do investors for those kind of companies want to see? And it's not rocket science. You know, they want to see what makes your tech special. Why is it better, different and better than other people's? What are your USPs? And then they want to see if that's protected. Now, that seems very simple, but actually there's quite a lot wrapped up in that. So if you go into a particularly newish startup in its first couple of years, there's a huge amount of kind of buzz and energy, a huge amount of innovation and general kind of excitement that is just driving this business forward. If you sit down with any one engineer and say, well, what is it about your tech that makes it special? And you might have a look at, say, their pipeline, which in a machine learning AI context is probably going to have a lot of stuff in it that actually isn't that special. Because in AI and machine learning, there's an awful lot of work that develops on top of existing work using existing frameworks, models, open source, that kind of thing. So ask an engineer in that company, what is it that makes your tech special? 9 times out of 10, the answer you'll get is, well, nothing really. It's just all routine. It's routine engineering. It's just incremental developments. It's just, you know, day-to-day problem solving. But actually, it's a lot more than that. And with the bigger companies, they have systems in place for capturing the innovation in their company, recognizing it, internal training and the kind of ethos where engineers day to day actually learn to recognize when what they're doing might be innovative. If you ask senior execs, what is it that makes your tech special? If you ask 5 of them, you'll probably get 5 slightly different answers. It'll all be broadly consistent. But the core of an IP strategy that's going to make it attractive to investors is really understanding, where does your tech drive your business forward? What makes your tech special that people are driven to you over other people? And it's not a long road to that, but it does take some work, and it takes some training, particularly with your engineers, who need to start to perceive their work they're doing in the context. And actually, as we'll talk about, the patent system can provide a useful framework for that, because it's a structured process for evaluating and rewarding innovation. Now, if you can overcome this first hurdle, you're well over halfway there on an IP strategy that is making your IP attractive to investors and boosting the value of your business. The second question is it protected? Now, once you've identified what it is, that's a much, much easier question to answer. And actually, even by identifying it and taking some fairly straightforward steps to raise awareness within your company about, yes, the protection that can be afforded by things like confidential information, but the steps you have to do to actually secure that and the limits of it, you're more or less there. Because what you now have is a credible IP strategy that's aligned with your business strategy. They're not fighting against each other. They're not 2 separate things existing in separate worlds. It's not, we've got this one patent that Simon 2 years ago insisted we filed, and we did, and he thought it was very important, but he's left now, and we're not really sure what it even does. It's about aligning your IP strategy with your business strategy to actually add value and attract investment. So how does this work? As if we look at this, a fairly typical looking at this level, machine learning, pipeline, data-driven. A lot of familiar elements here to anyone who knows anything about machine learning and AI. So the question to ask is, what is it that makes yours unique? And I don't just mean within that what makes it new, what's different. I'm talking about what are the key things that really differentiate you over other people, that make you stand out in the market. And that could be, for example, your user interface, and particularly some of the stuff we were hearing about earlier. If you've got a really clever user interface with some functions that kind of abstracts away from all this complexity in the back end and opens this up to a broader range of users, you can pin down a set of core features at your UI layer that are doing that, and no one else is doing it. You haven't seen it there. There's a gap in the market for that. The other might be the training. So, you might be doing something that other people are trying to do, but actually, and you might be using similar models as well, and maybe even similar-ish data sets, but actually you've cracked something in the training that lets you do this. You can get better performance with less data or messier data. You've overcome some problem that just means you get better results at your UI or wherever it is you're providing them. And the other might be data selection. So if let's say you're in a kind of data science area and you've got a kind of crack team of data scientists who have really, over a number of years, developed the skills and expertise to really understand and cleanse this data before it even goes into your models. That as well could be one of the core things, which is why you were just giving something that other people can't do at the moment. And this is a process of structured training within the company and persuading particularly software engineers to appreciate the value of what they and their colleagues are doing day to day. Now, once you've done this, as I say, that's more than half the battle, because in terms of setting out a coherent IP strategy that aligns with your business strategy, you just explain the steps you've taken on the advice of your attorneys to protect these things. And that could be something like a patent application around the UI for the key features you've developed. And they're the same key features that you've developed in your business strategy as being a really key differentiator. Something like the training, you might be selling this actually, particularly nowadays, selling in the sense of advertising. So with more and more of the kind of overlap between startup innovation and academia, it might be that you're actually publishing academic papers on this to demonstrate your leading edge expertise. And that's fine as part of your IP strategy if you've taken steps before you've filed your paper to crystallize those assets and secure some patent protection before they go into the public domain. And I'm aware I'm skipping ahead a little bit there around patents in the public domain, but we are going to come back to that in a minute. But this will hopefully provide a little bit of business context to that. Your IP strategy can also be about identifying those IP assets that are, as Sharon used the term, soft IP assets. So these might be the things that you can't actively protect by filing patent applications, say, but you can protect them by taking steps to firstly identify them within the company and ensure that steps around your confidential information have been taken to ensure that they meet the legal standards of confidentiality. And when coupled with an ongoing review process to assess this as a company develops, you now have a highly credible IP strategy to present to investors to just demonstrate the value of your IP assets in the context of your business. It doesn't necessarily mean spending lots and lots of money on patents. A key element of your IP strategy can be identifying novel things that are not core to your business and that you've, for budgetary reasons, made a decision not to try and patent, for instance, at this time. Investors appreciate that startups have limited funds, and this shows a kind of maturity and IP awareness that you are adding the most value by focusing your spend on the IP assets that are core to your business and keeping your options open in the future for your non-core IP assets. So I'm not going to go through this slide in too much detail, but as you might see, there's a few things set out on this slide that to some of you might be kind of things you think, well, that, yes, I kind of did think that at one point. We're a little limited for time today, so I'm not going to run through all these in detail, but I will just make the point that these are, generally speaking, misconceptions about IP and patents. And if you are too strongly being led by some of these assumptions and hearsay around this stuff, you could be endangering some of that value in your business because you're going to be having IP assets that you don't really know about. You don't even appreciate you have them. And if you're not taking steps to secure them, you're not going to have them forever. As Sharon was saying at the beginning, as we're going to see later, we're going to talk about how those assets can diminish over the time if you're not aware of them and taking steps to do something about them. So I've talked about that kind of in the abstract and very much from a kind of business leader's perspective. So I'm going to hand back to Virginia now to put a little bit more context around that by what we mean by different types of intellectual property.
Thanks very much. So this pie chart is divided into three colours just to give you a very quick flavour of the different kinds of intellectual property assets that can feed into your IP strategy. So in the dark blue, we have the confidential information, trade secrets and know-how, some of which Tom has touched on. And these are all intellectual property assets which are concrete, but they do take steps to actually ensure that they exist. So you may think that you automatically have confidential information because you've kept something in confidence, you think. But there has to be a bit more to it than that. So these are things where you don't have to register them with any authority, but you do have to take affirmative steps. In the light blue are intellectual property rights where you definitely have to take registration steps with a relevant authority like a patent office or a trademark office or a design office. And we're going to touch on those later. And then in the pink slice are rights which you don't actually have to do anything affirmative. You do acquire them automatically. So that would be great, right? You can just have the ones in the pink slice. But the downside with those is that they come with limitations attached when it comes to giving you proper protection. And we're just going to have a look at some of that. So copyright, this is the one which is the let's say the leader, let's say the main favorite with software companies. Software has copyright, so we're fine. We don't need patents, we don't need anything else. One big limitation on copyright is that if you want to assert that somebody else has done the same thing as you or taken your idea, you have to be able to demonstrate that they actually copied what you have copyright in. And that is the code of the software, the actual software itself, not the idea underlying it. And so you are very exposed if you rely on copyright alone. In fact, Jamie mentioned AI-inspired music. And I was particularly interested in that because we had some involvement with a company that did exactly that, AI-generated music. And their initial approach was to consider that they could rely on copyright on the code that they were using to break the music down, build their database structure, and generate new music on demand. But the difficulty is that nobody could actually go in and see how that was working. So although somebody else could take the idea off their user interface, well, that's great, we just feed this in and we get this music out. They could then recode their own music generation, maybe not quite as well, but enough to do damage to the marketplace that the real innovator, the first person who thought of it, was trying to grab. So copyright is real, it exists automatically, it is useful, but it's seriously limited. Confidential information is worth mentioning because this is something else that we often hear from software companies, which is, well, again, it's fine because it's all locked down. It's all in the back end. Therefore, it's confidential information. It's ours. We're protected. But actually, confidential information requires an assertive duty of confidence. It's not enough just to think that it's locked down or in the back end and nobody can see it, therefore it's in confidence. You have to actually expressly apply a duty of confidence within your company. And that's where a part of the training that we do actually involves really explaining to engineers and leaders in the company how to make sure confidential information is actually identified and properly locked down with a duty of confidence. However, confidential information isn't a tag that sticks to information forever. As soon as the knowledge enters the public domain, that tag is gone. It's no longer yours. It's no longer your own proprietary information. Even if it was yours in the first place, you've now lost it. And it doesn't protect against independent derivation. So if somebody else derives the same idea or comes up with the same algorithm or database structure or software concept, your confidential information can't be used against them because they didn't take your confidential information. They independently conceived it. And also, even worse, it doesn't stop someone else from patenting it. So if you have confidential information that you've kept confidential and somebody else develops the same kind of thing, they could patent it even though you got there first. So again, an important right, but with serious limitations. So how do we get through some of these, important but limited rights? And what else can you do? And that's where patents come in. So patents are a true monopoly right. They're granted by respective government authorities in different countries. They do protect the broad concept that your software or AI is implementing, and they can last a long time. We haven't really talked about duration. And as Jamie and others have pointed out, the field of AI moves so fast that 20 years is really an eternity. So a patent that lasts for a few years is absolutely fine as well, but they can last up to 20 years. So can you protect software and AI innovation with patents? Yes, you can. And that's a very, very definite yes. And perhaps the single most important takeaway from our talk today is that you can patent software solutions. Any software solution to a technical problem, which is new and unobvious. The problem can be solved in software. The problem could be related to technical applications of machine learning models, training methods, data collection, all the things that Heather and Sunil and Jamie have talked about today. As long as it's new and non-obvious, you can get a patent for it. Now, I was going to hand back to Tom, although I'm conscious that we're going to have to constrain quite a lot of our material just in view of time limits.
Thanks, Virginia. So as Virginia says, I'll race through this. I've talked at the beginning a little bit about, the good way to build a comprehensive IP strategy that complements your business. This is a semi-hypothetical case study of how not to do it. So if we consider let's say it's a startup in data science, basically they've solved a particular problem in data science and they're the leaders in the field because they got there first. They've had a leading edge for a good couple of years. They provide their software expertise to larger companies and are basically there as external experts to help these companies and to provide them with tools to understand and unlock their data. And as we talked about before, they might have some sort of particular pieces of novelty around their user interface, say in their back end, that are really driving this system forward and making this pipeline so good. Now, they don't have any IP strategy, so they haven't considered the possibility that their user interface might be something they could protect with patents. And for their back end, they rely on this sort of loose notion of trade secrets to protect their core AI and analytics. It's all trade secrets, without much thought or consideration to what that actually means or what the limitations of that might be. And this is all fine for a couple of years. As I say, they're the leaders in the field. Their first mover advantage gets them a long way. But in their particular business model, their customers are big companies with their own in-house tech teams. And that leading edge starts to diminish over their time, not least because their customers are starting to learn from them. And there comes a point when that big customers, say their biggest customer, the CTO, takes a look at everything that's going on and says, we're spending quite a lot of money on these external people when we've got a great in-house team here. Thanks very much, but I think we're going to take this in-house. To which the startup might say, well, surely you can't do that. My tech's proprietary. And in the very first, nascent days of the company, that's probably true, because before you have a business, what you have is a bunch of confidential ideas, none of which have entered the public domain. And they are protected by the duty of confidence because it's only one or two people and they're doing it together in the context of building a business. But the broad stuff in that starts to leak out very quickly, because as you know, if you're a leader in a business, you can't just keep all your cards to your chest. If you're trying to sell a tech business, you need to be telling people what makes your tech good. You can't just say, we've got this magic black box, can we have some money, please? Particularly nowadays, but there's, people are pretty skeptical of AI black boxes. So this stuff starts to leak out into the public domain. And as we've heard from Virginia there a minute ago, as soon as that's out in the public domain, and you haven't taken any steps to secure it through patent protection, that's it. It's gone for good, and you have no protection over it, and anyone else is free to take those ideas and reproduce them themselves. And this gets worse over time, particularly as you start to release your products or you exhibit at tech events, all of these things that can happen that essentially leave you with an awful lot of what was at one point your core IP protected by confidential information. That protection is now gone, and there isn't anything there to take its place. Now, you might, at the middle of this, have a sort of notion of core IP and trade secrets. You think, well, it's okay. We know a lot of our stuff is out there, but this we're locking down. This no one knows about, and this is the kind of secret source that you really need to make this work. But is it that secret at all? So one thing that engineers, scientists like to do is talk about their technology with other scientists. And what we've seen time and time again is these sort of startups, this notion of core IP and trade secrets, actually as part of the process of giving a good service to your customers and building your business, this is just starting to leak out over time. And that's more and more stuff that's just leaking out into the public domain, where you just no longer benefit from the provisions of confidential information, because that information is no longer confidential. So essentially what you're left with is, well, no, it's not really proprietary. And then add to that all the other things that might have happened to diminish this. For example, a PhD student who interned at a company for 6 months included key details of the back end in their PhD thesis. That's not a hypothetical one there. That has really happened to companies we've worked with. Marketing team pitching ideas with no knowledge of the tech team. Again, real. Independent derivation by competitors, as Virginia talked about. Disclosing to multiple people under NDA so that those NDAs just aren't worth the paper they're written on anymore. And what you see is a diminishing of those soft IP assets over time, because the only thing that was protecting them, really, the core ideas themselves, as opposed to the code, was the confidential information, and the confidentialness has been lost. So what you're left with is copyright in the software of a product that, as Virginia said, is now potentially no longer the unique in the market, because your customer have taken it and run with it. you know, it might be that it's only perceived as not unique. You know, it could be a greatly inferior solution that your customer's done, but it's that perception that matters for the purpose of valuing these assets.
Yes, and so in my so I've got to very, very quickly explain how you get from that diminishing red line curve to this more positive upwards going curve, which is really what people like to see when they're leading companies or showing things to investors. And the answer to many of those issues that Tom has mentioned would have been to file patent applications and obtain patents. And that's something that we are able to help companies with, and very happy to talk to any of you out there who want a bit more information about this. But essentially, if the startup had applied for patent protection before the user interface entered the public domain, before the core analytics method that they reckoned was back-end and trade secret entered the public domain, they would have had enormous commercial and business advantages. So just going back very quickly to that music inspiration example, patents were indeed filed and granted related to the manner in which particular objects in the software were used to represent music and joined together to develop the music which was generated, and the manner in which the APIs and user interfaces operated. A very common myth is that that just would not be patentable. So I think I'm probably literally just going to leave there, highly conscious that we need some time for Q&A, and just say thank you very much, everybody.